She also works as the Deputy Director of Indigenous Health Research within the Faculty of Science, Medicine and Health at the University of Wollongong. She's also a member of the Niru and Naju First Peoples Health and Wellbeing Research Centre at the University of Wollongong. And finally, and most relevant for today, is that Maria is the Associate Director for the Person-Centered Practice International Community of Practice for the rest of the world. Please join me in welcoming Ria for the Acknowledgement of Country and official welcome to the symposium.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It always gives me a little giggle when I get that little title of the rest of the world. Yeah, I'd also like to welcome everyone here to the first online ICoP International Symposium. It's really exciting to be here with all of you today. So just to start with acknowledging country, I'm a Wiradjuri woman and I have a strong connection to the country I work on, which is the lands of the Wadi Wadi and Darwin people, and where I live, which is the lands of the Budawan people. I respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we gather today, and I'd invite you to think about the land you're sitting on today and maybe place the name of those lands in the chat box so we know the kind of vastness of where everyone's coming from and the wonderful parts of the lands that are here today with us. I recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been here on these lands for tens of thousands of years, and I acknowledge the deep connection that our people have with the land, waterways and all living things. I acknowledge the truth of the painful history of colonisation, dispossession and injustices inflicted upon Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in this country, and I acknowledge the devastating impacts of policies such as forced removals, cultural suppression, systematic discrimination that continue to reverberate through our communities today. In acknowledging this truth, I recognise that many Australians are committed to ongoing reconciliation, healing and justice. I recognise the importance of listening to and learning from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's voices, cultures and wisdoms. I commit to work towards a future of respect and partnership that acknowledges the sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, a future where our rights, knowledge and perspectives are valued and upheld. And may this acknowledgement be a step towards truth-telling, healing and building a future together on this land. I would also like to personally acknowledge the wisdom of all my ancestors and our ancestors and the path walked by our elders that brought us here where we are today. And I would like to acknowledge the commitment and courage of all my brothers and sisters here today, including my non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal brothers and sisters who are here with us and willing to join us for today. Always was, always will be. I'd also like to highlight that we should acknowledge country in a meaningful way, and I'm really thankful for the committee in wanting to do that, in a way that provokes us to consider our connection to country and what brings our awareness to the truth of the history of Australia from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. So I just ask us to pause maybe for a little minute and think about the meaningful of this rather than just rushing into the business of the day. So thank you, everyone. And moving to the introduction of this fabulous day, which is my pleasure to introduce us to what we're going to share together today. As I said, I'd like to welcome everyone to our first Person-Centered Symposium, and our theme today is shining a light on person-centeredness in healthcare. And so before diving into the day in the essence of person-centered ways of being, I thought we could maybe have a bit of fun and connection and think about using the chat box to introduce ourselves, maybe to share our name and our location, but not just that, maybe to do that in a way that you start by thinking about an emotion that you have today that matches the first letter of your name. So for instance, I'm Mindful Maria and I'm currently sitting on Darwin country. So if everyone just wants to pop something into the chat box to get us started, and just, yeah, in a way that we are imaginative and connecting, and hopefully that's how we're going to work through today together. Thank you, everyone, for popping that in and peek. Bloody-minded Brendan probably gets the prize.
No, I think Bendy Beck is much better.
So we're on a 24-hour conference, and for some of you have registered for one part of the conference and some for both, and you'll have links depending on how you registered. The first session we're kicking off here in the Southern Hemisphere, and the second session will be in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's a really exciting way, I think, to share our knowledge together. And I know we've got some people the Northern Hemisphere here with us today, so they're staying up late, and I intend to stay up a little bit late and join a little bit of theirs tonight as well. So the structure of today is that in the Southern Hemisphere, we're starting off. Brendan's going to start by challenging us to think and moving throughout different perspectives of person-centeredness. We'll hear from lots of different people, and we're going to close with a strategic focus on how the world of healthcare could embrace human-to-human connections. So Kelly will be facilitating the morning session, and Beck's going to facilitate the afternoon session, and they will introduce themselves to you and how they're connected to person-centeredness as well. There's a session before lunch today. Then we're going to have a lunch break, but during lunch we'll be inviting you to participate in illuminating person-centeredness by sharing thoughts, reflections, provocations and challenges, and more information will be provided for you just before lunch. You're going to hear various views from academics, clinicians, health service managers, and after lunch we're going to hear from the lived experience of a person who has experienced healthcare. And I've put in brackets here, I don't like to call them consumers. I talk about people who experience healthcare. And she's going to talk a little bit about that as well. We encourage you to listen and reflect during the 15-minute talk. And then after each talk, each speaker will have questions for 15 minutes. And this is hopefully going to be an informal discussion where we do encourage you to, as you're listening, maybe take a few little points that you can think about, but think about how we can be provocative and thinking about how the world of healthcare could look a little bit differently moving forward. So we're really asking you to be active, to be brave, ask questions, and because we do really need to challenge our very contemporary and privileged world that we live in healthcare, and see how person-centeredness can inform the future that we could be more innovative and creative in. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So everyone keep themselves on mute when you're not talking, so we kind of cut out that background noise. If you do want to speak, show us your face. We understand people won't have their cameras on all day, but if you want to speak, if you can turn that on when we're interacting with each other. We also need to be mindful of respect, responsibility and reciprocity. And these are sort of, normally we would do shared values, but in this environment we won't be doing that. But thinking about how we can work collaboratively together, be brave and curious whilst we use gentle language. So what you say, you don't need to respect differences. Responsibility is really thinking about us being active in our participation today. And reciprocity is also thinking about what we can give, as well as all the things we're going to receive from the wisdom that we hear today. So before I hand back to Kelly, has anyone got any burning questions, any comments you want to pop in the chat box you'd like to clarify before we launch into what's going to be a wonderful day together? No? It's like being on Zoom with a group of students, isn't it? All right, I'm going to hand back over to Kelly, and I will come back at the end for the concluding remarks as well. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Ria. So I will just introduce myself very briefly. I'm Kelly Marriott Statham. I am a member of the Person-Centered Practice, International Community Practice, and also am currently in the arm of this in the Student International Community Practice, or PCP-ICoP. I'm a PhD candidate at Queen Margaret University, where I had great initiation into the world of person-centeredness by Jan Dewing and Caroline Dixon. I'm also a lecturer at the University of Wollongong, and I'm also a registered nurse, and I have a bit of a passion for the care of old persons. So that's me, just so you know a little bit about me as I flit in and out throughout the morning. So now I have the pleasure to introduce the guy who probably needs no introduction here, but here I am, tasked with the impossible. So I'd like to introduce or reintroduce to you Professor Brendan McCormack. He's the founder and director of Person-Centered Practice, International Community of Practice, and the head of school and dean of the Susan Wakehill School of Nursing and Midwifery and the Susan Wakehill Nursing Professor at the University of Sydney. He's a very accomplished researcher, as I'm sure you all know, with particular focus on the development of person-centered cultures, practices, and processes. He has engaged in this work at all levels, from theory development to implementation science and through to instrument design, testing, and evaluation. He loves delving into the use of the arts and creativity too, to make a bit of meaning. Brendan has particular expertise in gerontology and dementia practices, but his work has spanned all specialties and all healthcare disciplines. He has published more than 600 outputs, 240 peer-reviewed publications and in international journals, and 12 books. He's been cited over 25,000 times. He's a fellow at many prestigious internationally recognized institutions. He is recognized globally as one of the most influential researchers, and actually he's so famous he has his own Wikipedia page, which I just found out yesterday. So please join me in welcoming the very amazing Professor McCormack.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I think I just want to go and lie down now after all of that, but I'll recover eventually. But wonderful, and thank you so much for that introduction. And so wonderful to see so many familiar faces on this event as well. And to be part of it, and to actually kick this off for the first time ever that we've had such an event. So it's brilliant we're doing this. Before I go any further, I do want to thank the guy in the background, Webb Tiaggi, who's been making all this happen. Webb sits outside my office door, so I know the kind of stress and challenges he's been under to get this off the ground, and he's done an amazing job to get the whole thing to work together. So really appreciate that, and you'll see something from him later, I think. So in the spirit of recognizing the lands that we're all on, and my dear colleagues who are Indigenous nurses and friends here, I want to pay respects to the lands of the people that I'm on, the Gadigal people, and this wonderful privilege we have to be on this amazing university site on this land, and really show the respect I do strongly believe in to all the people who occupy these lands and make it the kind of place that we all want to be in, which is a wonderful privilege. And I guess that kicks off the kind of tone I want to have for this presentation, which is really, we decided we'd do it a kind of conversation with, where I would throw some issues out for us to then have a conversation about. So I'm going to hopefully only speak for about 20 minutes. As you know me, I could speak for about 5 hours continuously without drawing a breath. But I am going to restrict myself from doing that and really just focus on some key highlights that I want just us to then engage in a conversation about, and hopefully kind of just have something that kind of triggers us to think more deeply about person-centeredness and where we're at with all of that. And recognizing there is a list of people speaking after me who are going to also say some wonderful things that will either connect or challenge or dispute what I'm saying, and all of that's totally fine. That's what I really want to happen. Now, I'm not sure if I've got control of the slides or not, or is it you, Webb? I think you might have. Okay, next one then. So just a few background points before I then kind of raise some of the kind of issues. I suppose my first provocation is that I'm kind of a bit over this view that person-centeredness is somehow new, and that it's, somehow fallen from a spaceship last week, and that we all, have been profoundly affected by it. It's been around for bloody millions of years, frankly, and has been conceptualized in various ways, but it's I guess, in the 20th century particularly, where it started to be formalized into more of a theory. Can you go back to the previous slide, Webb? Thanks. Where it's been formulated into more around theories and concepts and principles, but philosophers ancient have been talking about person-centeredness, and slightly offline, but yesterday I was given this wonderful book about the ancient traditional healing practices of the Aboriginal communities of Australia, which again is full of what I would call person-centered principles in those healing practices that have been around for millennia. So let's not kind of keep this narrative going of somehow this is a new thing that's landed on our heads last week, and we all have to try and adjust to understand it. And in this slide, we know this is a lot of the work I've been involved in, but it is a global phenomenon. It is something that is very much shaping the way healthcare is practiced around the world today. Next slide. But I guess one of the big challenges for all of us is to actually have a deeper understanding of it than just this phrase. We know that the phrase is easy to use, is well used, is chucked out in all kinds of contexts, sometimes weaponized to make people feel bad about what they do, and also used in a way that's quite trivial and quite trite, and actually is disrespectful of persons, actually, even though the words might be used. And so for us, and for all of the work that I've been engaged in with many of the wonderful people on this webinar and people around the world, we try and go out.
Could you put me through to Meredith Potter, the data manager for theatres? Thanks.
Sorry about that. Vicky, you might need to mute. Thanks. That for us, it's much more about the whole of a person's personhood and the kind of philosophical, ontological, epistemological underpinnings of who we are in this world. And again, our work has tried to reflect that in ways that people can connect with. There's a lot of heavy philosophy about personhood, but actually, fundamentally, it's about a way of being. It's about who am I as a person? What is it that represents my uniqueness? And how do we then use that in context to help us to connect with each other as persons? So in our work, person-centered is much more about a way of being before we think about the doing. And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges we have in this area with the evidence and with the way it's kind of demonstrated in healthcare policy and practice. Next slide. But person-centered practice culture is pretty fundamental to all of this in healthcare. And I know there are some people on this webinar as well who are going to talk about this and the work that they are doing, which is quite brilliant in trying to create such cultures. And those of you who know me know that I rarely talk about person-centered care per se, because for me, person-centered care is a philosophically challenged idea if we don't talk about person-centered cultures as a whole. And yet that is consistently what we do in healthcare, is talk about the care that people receive rather than actually about the culture that sustains and elevates that care into something that's important. So again, in our work, we have really privileged the idea of cultures and creating cultures that are respectful of all persons. And I'm delighted to be here in Sydney doing the work that I'm doing with people like Royanne, which is really challenging and extending some of this even further. And that's really exciting, which I think you'll hear a bit more about later. But at the core of this is the idea of healthfulness. And healthfulness is about our shared responsibility to create places where we all can be well in. It's our shared responsibility to engage in ways that energize us, that elevate us as persons, that holds our personhood, and that keeps us well as persons. And for me, that is the essence of what person-centeredness is actually about. The rest follows, but that is the core goal of what we're trying to achieve. Next slide. The person-centered practice framework, those of you, again, who've been around this field for a while, has been around now for 23 years or so, and has had various machinations. This is the most recent version in the book that's published in 2021, but essentially it has, for those 20 years, been one of the only whole systems holistic approach to person-centeredness. And I'm not ashamed of saying that, because we have looked and we are still looking. define similar frameworks that are holistic and in their approach, and they don't exist. They either elevate person-centered care, they elevate a particular element, but they don't look at the whole thing. And that is a real challenge again that we have in this space in terms of how we develop it, but also how we research and evaluate it as well, and how we make connections with it. Next slide, please. The person-centered practice framework, as I said, has genuinely been globally adopted. I think it's translated to 16 languages now. That's just been a few more added to the list. It's used all around the world and has been underpinned a whole host of work, a lot of which you will hear about today. And if ever I was I'm not a big fan of this, what's your legacy? Because it's kind of an ego-driven thing. But if I was to be ever proud of anything that I've done in my life, it would be this work that I've done with Tanya, who is a dear, dear colleague and friend. And we have managed to sustain working and collaborative and inclusive relationship for 23 years now. So that's not bad going in any kind of collaboration. And I think that is important to us in terms of how we see what we're talking about in terms of person-centered. This is not just a thing. It's not just a technical task of doing this work. It's a genuine, really embodied commitment to trying to create change in the world, which we still feel very passionately about. Next slide. And having done all of that work for over 23 years now, we can demonstrate significant impact from it. We always get challenged about what's been the impact of our work, and particularly by, let's name it, by positivists who want to measure hard outcomes and are only interested in the hard outcome and refuse to understand every other kind of outcome. And there have been a number of critiques in the literature of our work saying, but we don't show any outcome. And that is totally untrue, because it's actually an epistemological stance when we say that. Outcome is much more than the how does X lead to Z. It's actually about the whole contextual shaping of people's lived experiences and how we elevate that as outcome in itself. And we can quite confidently, through this systematic approach we've taken to demonstrating that outcome, to show the impact of this work around the world. However, next slide. The conversation that Tanya and I have on a fairly regular basis, I have to say, and sometimes when we're feeling a bit down about it all and thinking, really, should we just walk away from this and let it go? And then we are very much critical companions, and we will often kind of land in that space and say, what are we doing this for? And, what is the point when we have yet another challenge, or yet another example of poor practice, or yet another story from a friend or a colleague of, frankly, really shit care. And we think, look, what are we doing? And I guess that's what led to us wanting to have this conversation, to say, if we have been so successful in this egotistical driven kind of way, then why the hell is it that healthcare is still struggling to have what we might see as even some of the fundamentals of person-centered healthcare? And as Roy-Ann, I'm going to quote you because it's been a driver for the work we've been doing here. As Roy-Ann would say to me, if person-centeredness has been such an important thing in healthcare, then why is it that my people are still unnecessarily dying? And that is a profound question that once Roy-Ann said it to me, has landed in my head and has never left it. And has also been behind why Tanya and I feel there's real questions we have to ask about the reality of this. Next slide. So we kind of identified that there are a whole collection of issues, and we've been using these to kind of make challenges to healthcare organizations over a few years. And what I want to do is to kind of just kind of raise a few of these as conversational issues for us to pay attention to, conscious of my time. So next slide. We've identified that there are 7 kind of core reasons, I think, why person-centered practice struggles to really have the kind of impact it should have if we all are being genuine about what it is we're about. And I just want to say something about each of these 7. I'm not going to go into depth because I won't have time, and I prefer us to have the conversation. But I do want to just say something about each of them, knowing that I could talk all day about all of them, but that's not going to be that helpful. So the first one, next slide, is the problem of language. Again, I am a bit fed up of constantly having to defend person-centeredness as a phrase and a language, and other people trying to say, oh, but it's, you know, it's not the same as relationship-centered, or it's not the same as family-centered, or it's not no, it's not the same, but it does connect with it, and it holds these kind of things. Person-centeredness embraces all of these other forms of centeredness that exist, because it is a holistic, whole person approach. And we need to kind of get away from this kind of, again, I see it as an ego-driven approach to kind of trying to elevate particular terms over another. Fundamentally, all of these things are about trying to get the best for persons and to respect individual personhood. But not all of them do that. And we have to be really careful about the way we elevate particular words over another one, because it actually, language matters, and language can either hinder development, or it can really help people to connect and to grow and develop. Next slide. The next challenge, I think, is about competing concepts and theories. Again, you know, we have had lots of there's lots of evidence around, you know, well, I don't do person-centeredness. I use the relationship-centered care model, or more recently, it's no, we don't do person-centered care. We do fundamentals of care, or no, we don't do that. We do empathy, and it just goes on and on and on and on as we try to kind of privilege particular concepts or theories. And again, I think it gets in the way of us doing good work in terms of trying to create these kind of conditions. Next slide. And so I generally these days refuse to get embroiled in these discussions about which theory is better than another one, because actually it's a dead end, and it's not a place that takes us anywhere. Those of us who are nurses on this call were around that and are old enough, were around that debate in the 1980s when armchair theorists from the US had to try to fight out which was the best theory, and we all were part of it, and it led us nowhere. In fact, this led us to a worse position, because then we just rejected those theoretical concepts and went to a very bland evidence-based practice model, which does nothing for anyone. So my stance is very much that what we have to look at are the core principles. So if we're talking about a person-centered theory that helps us to really pay attention to the whole person and the system within which that person exists, then it should embrace three core principles. And I don't mind whether that's person-centered theory, fundamentals of care, relationship-centered. It should hold these three tests. The first is that it should represent human caring from a relational ethics perspective, that it should hold that as a core tradition, a humanistic tradition of why it is that we care in a health system in the first place. It should represent the personhood of all persons. And if this was to be my own critique of major theories, that is my biggest one, is that it elevates some persons over others, and privileges some persons over others, whereas a person-centered or a theory that is trying to emulate the importance of persons should equally represent the personhood of all persons. There is no hierarchy in personhood. It's a core fundamental principle. And thirdly, it should adopt a whole systems approach. It shouldn't just privilege certain parts of the system, but it should be focused on trying to work with the whole system. And so I don't mind what theory people use if it meets these three conditions. And in philosophy, there is always the test, which is it necessary and sufficient? And that is the test that we have to always apply to our theories that we're looking at. Is what they say necessary, but is it sufficient to meet the requirements of the system we're working into? Next slide. The third issue is that of the implicit versus explicit knowledge. Next slide. And in nursing, we have this huge challenge around this. And the biggest way that this kind of gets identified is probably most days of my life, I have a conversation with somebody about person-centeredness and they say, yeah, we do it anyway. And it's this kind of implicit view that we do person-centered naturally, that it's just something that happens, that somehow we're born with it. I don't believe that for 1 second, that is the case. But actually, particularly in nursing, we have that challenge, that it's very difficult for us to say, actually, I don't think I am person-centered, because that is such a big statement in terms of me as a person. And I remember that back to my own PhD when I was doing my data collection in 1994, when I wanted to ask the nurses I was working with about, you know, their caring practices. And it struck me really quickly that if I said to any of them, you know, do you care for these older people that we're working with? They're hardly going to say, no, I don't. And they're always going to say, yes, I do. And they're always going to say, I'm person-centered. I wasn't using that language explicitly at the time. I was using autonomy and relation and shared decision-making. And of course, they're going to say that. So instead, what I did was wired them with tape recorders as they worked and analyze their conversations. So I could start to look at it a different way rather than what we say, because we all need to see ourselves as person-centered people, and we have lots of blind spots about it, but it's based on our implicit, you know, knowledge, our intuition, if we want to use that phrase, rather than a really deep reflexive analysis of how we connect and how we engage. And again, it's a huge challenge when we're doing research in this space in terms of the methods we use to understand it better. Next slide, please. Our next issue is that of our obsession with the doing of person-centeredness. Next slide. And this, I guess, is probably one of the biggest challenges we have in terms of the research space, because so much of the research into person-centeredness is about the doing of it, and particularly the doing of person-centered care in one-to-one or small group kind of situations. And we know, and you know, there is an organization that very much is in this research space explicitly, and I know that they have done about 11 clinical trials of person-centered interventions in caregiving situations, but yet not one of those outcomes have been sustained for any length of time. Which kind of reinforces that it's not just about, you know, what is the intervention that somebody does to create that care connection, but it's about the context in which that intervention exists and the being of the practitioner to sustain it over time. And person-centeredness is about relationships. It is about relationships that honor the personhood of others, and it's about a deep understanding of self. Who am I as a person first, before we can start to understand the doing. We're probably quite famous for this phrase of person-centered moments versus person-centered care, because that came from work that Tanya and I did back in 2010, maybe earlier, and actually 2004, just suddenly had a flashback, where we did, over a whole hospital system, we did patient stories with patients and families across the whole of the system. And what we identified was that very few patients experienced person-centered care, but what they all told us about were these moments where they felt respected and treated as a person. And we coined the phrase that it was, you know, what we have is person-centered moments rather than person-centered care in most of our system. And I still stand by that even today. And it actually is a helpful thing for us to do, because it starts to say, well, if you can create these moments, then how do you connect up these moments? What gets in the way of these moments lasting a longer period of time? So we can start to add a more appreciative approach to how we unpick the context, how we work with culture, and how we help people to understand themselves in this system. But again, it requires us to just not focus on the doing, but to really think about the being of practitioners and the being of persons that we connect with. The next slide, please. I guess one of the experiences that we've had over many years, next slide, is trying to change cultures in healthcare organizations. And that's been the majority of my work, I would say, in many ways. And what I have found consistently, some of it really quite very highly challenging, has been that many and most organizations espouse person-centeredness in their strategies, be that, you know, a pillar of work like we see in some, or a part of a vision statement, or a goal around, particularly for person-centered care. But then when it comes to the actualization of that in practice, it doesn't quite play out in that same way. And I know you're going to hear from people like Karen Takiri and others who are embedded in that kind of work, trying to make it happen. But what I've experienced and why now I believe really strongly in focusing my work much more at a kind of organizational strategic management level is that managers and leaders say they want this kind of care. But actually, when we then go in to try and change it to address the issues that are getting in the way, they don't want it because it is too challenging, because it requires some deep change in organizations. It's not just surface level, changes. It requires some really deep thinking and really profound change in the way that healthcare works. And I've had two quite significant experiences where the executives of health systems essentially asked us to leave because they did not want us to be exposing the kind of things we were exposing that were getting in the way of what was being asked of. So we have to really think about how do we genuinely have healthcare strategy that does enable person-centeredness and person-centered cultures to happen in every clinical unit, every team, every setting where people receive care and where people provide care. And next slide. Two more to go. Lastly, second lastly is the issue of evaluation. Next slide. And again, as I said at the outset, we're often challenged for, where's the outcomes from your work when we apply a very narrow positivist kind of view of outcome. And my and Tanya stance on this is that person-centeredness is a complex intervention. No matter what way we look at it, and therefore it requires complex evaluation systems. You cannot evaluate the whole thing by just applying one method, which is often what we see doing. We have always taken the stance that you need multi-methods in order to evaluate person-centered. Right in my early days of my career, I used to describe it as a 12-lead ECG model. And the work we did in Oxford across the nursing development units was based on the idea of the 12-lead ECG. And we identified 12 different methods to look at practice contexts from 12 different angles. And that, for me, is a really important principle that we need to apply to evaluating whether a culture is person-centered or whether we are engaged in person-centered practice, and how does that look. But applying singular kind of hard to defined methods is not going to really tell us where we're at with all of this. And lastly, next slide, is the idea of sustainability. Again, as I've said, we can identify lots of examples, and I think all of us on this call can, lots of examples of initiatives and developments and innovations in person-centeredness, but they often leave as quick as they arrive. And we all could have that conversation for a long time because we've been part of it for many years. And so the key question is, how do we sustain it? And next slide, please. The work that we've been doing in the European project, which was developing a curriculum framework, which is much more than a curriculum framework, is actually a whole systems way of thinking about how organizations learn. And for me, that's the fundamental issue of sustainability. When we think about sustaining person-centeredness, it's not about the specific practices, because actually they should change all the time. What should be sustained is our ways of being and how we learn together to sustain cultures that are respectful of persons. And what we try to do in this framework is to capture that, to capture organizational learning models that look at every aspect of the system, again, being a whole system, in order to sustain it. So I really want us to kind of think about that it's not the individual practices that should be sustained. They should always change, but it is our ways of being and how we continue to learn together as a culture that we should be able to sustain long term. And last slide, just to leave with a thought, which is the one I pose to lots of people all the time, which is, for me, on those days when I'm thinking, why the hell am I still doing this? I should just stop. The question always in my head is, what's the kind of imprint I want to leave behind? And it's a question I want to pose to all of us is, what is that mark that we want to leave when we have stopped doing what we do? For me, it's always been about that I have respected a person people and populations, and that I have striven to do that. I've failed at it continuously, but that it is something that I would always want to stay doing, and that this work really helps me to do. And I think that's why we're all here, is that constant being driven by wanting to make that kind of imprint. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Lots of amazing questions posed there. Anyone want to have a go at answering any of them, or have anything to talk about with Brendan? He's left us lots of time. We've got 18 minutes left, Brendan. Well done.
I know, that's cool. I'm amazed.
Oh, we got a couple. I don't know who's in the D18 level 8 boardroom, but let's go for it.
I think that's Webb.
Oh, that's Webb. Oh, they've just put their hand down. Ria, do you want to go?
Yes, I'm happy to go. No, thanks, Brendan. I really enjoyed that, and it kind of has summarised the work that all of us have been following along with you and Tanya along the way, and trying to contribute to in our little tiny ways that we do. I'm really interested in the part where, well, firstly, the language part. I've just supervised a student who looked at the relationship between family and person-centred care, which I know that you're aware of, and you know, I suppose what we found in that kind of journey was the kind of lack of theoretical underpinning of other frameworks, and you did touch on that, but I'd be interested to hear more about, you know, person-centered is just talked about as mid-range theory, I think, still at the moment.
Yeah.
And what is it that we can contribute to building that theory, and how we work with, because I love the way that you described it, can embrace, or like that you don't necessarily have to compare, but you can embrace that. And maybe if you could share a little bit more about that and how we do work that helps us to embrace it. Because when you said that, I had a feeling of, we looked at the similarities and differences between the two, and I feel like we tried to challenge, not embrace, was what came to my mind. And I thought, how could we move that? And we're about to publish this work. How could we move that into more of a embrace language?
Yeah, great question. And I think the problem is we often start, it's kind of and maybe it's an academic bent, we start from that position of challenging established concepts and theories. It's kind of built into us to do that kind of thing. And I'm not against doing that. Of course, critique is so important, and I would always want our work to be open to critique, and for that to be done systematically, respectfully, and all the rest of it. I have no problem with that whatsoever. In fact, encourage it actively. But I think when I say embrace, what I mean is instead of starting from a position where we're going to reject that theory wholeheartedly, you know, out of it, and we're going to start somewhere else, I find that offensive, actually. And I find it really unhelpful as a way to think about concepts and theories. I mean, anyone who ever read the very original work on thinking with concepts, which is one of the very original philosophical texts about concepts and theories, know that there is no such thing really as a kind of a unique concept in the world. They all have roots in quite very, very ancient traditions and belief systems. And so to start from a position where we have to reject something in order to understand something else, for me, is academically wrong and intellectually wrong, and is never a good place for us to actually start from. The person-centered practice framework, I could critique myself and do on a regular basis. But what I mean by embracing is to say that because it is recognized as a mid-range theory, and mid-range theories are mid-range theories because they show connections between concepts that have been tested in practice and have application in practice, and together form a theoretical stance, then of course it gives us a position, it gives us a platform that we can look at lots of other concepts and theories. And I won't steal Royanne's thunder, but the work we've been doing around the integrated framework we're doing here, I think is a great example of that now, where we're kind of free enough to say, yeah, we can change that. We're not losing the essence of what this thing is about, but we're stretching it and we're moving it into another context. So I think we can do that with things like relationship-centered care, with fundamentals of care, with woman-centered care, with family-centered care. All of those what are written in the literature too often as being competing theories or alternative theories. And for me, that just gets us nowhere. We actually need to show those connections between them, which is why I have adopted, and Tanya and I have discussed this, what are the core principles that we need to be saying that are necessary and sufficient for something to be focused on the personhood of persons, irrespective of that context. Just, I mean, a bit of a historical context of that was the very first publication on relationship-centered care, which was published by my good colleague and friend at the time, Mike Nolan, in a journal that I was the editor of, which was also quite a fascinating experience, was titled Beyond Person-Centered Care. And he basically wrote this paper to say relationship-centered care was a step beyond person-centeredness, and it blew my mind. And him and I had lots of public debates. We were invited to fight it out on stage quite a few times. Because the reason it blew my mind was not that I thought, fine, do what you like with relationship-centered care. It's this idea of being beyond person-centeredness. How can you be beyond person-centeredness when person-centeredness is about personhood, personhood is about relationships, relationships is fundamental to who we are as persons? You can't say that's beyond person. It does not, philosophically makes no sense. And I think that's an example of the kind of thing we see in the literature all the time.
Thanks, Brendan. That was fascinating. Webb, do you want to say something?
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you, Brendan, for the presentation. Really, really inspiring, actually. One of the things that I often think about whenever person-centeredness and the concept comes in is respecting the personhood of all persons that are involved in care, for example. What would your suggestion be to resolve the conflict if a conflict arises between so clarity of beliefs and values and cultural, religious, and political beliefs of the people being cared for, if it's in conflict with that of the practitioner?
Yeah, probably one of the most tricky areas in healthcare practice, I would say. But I don't think it shifts the fundamental principle of respecting all persons. But it is then about how do we layer the way we stand. So I draw on phenomenology here, and particularly Heidegger when I think about this, because what Heidegger would argue in terms of the nature of being is that as persons, we always are in a state of becoming. We are never fixed. We're never static. We are never a kind of an entity. We're kind of always in a. Well, if you were to translate some of his work, he would just say we're just a flash of air, which kind of just a moment that we just are in at that point. But what he does argue is that as persons, when we're in relation with another and trying to work with our own individual being as unique persons, is that we adopt different stances, and that those stances shape the way that I connect with you and show respect or not for you. And he talks about it as connectedness. So we have, total connectedness where I am completely alongside with you. There isn't a clash of values. We share the same view of how things should progress. We're absolutely in tune with each other, and we're able to work with that. And that's a kind of becomes then a very strong ontological stance that we're in together. And we have a shared ontology, a shared notion of what it means for us as persons. But something may happen, and it may be that, I have a religious belief that goes against what the request or the thing that you want to make happen. And there will be what Heidegger calls a partial disconnectedness. And in that moment, there is a gap between us. There is a gap where we are not in that same space. We are not in a shared ontology. We're actually in two separate ontologies, but we're still points of connection. What we have to draw on there, of course, then are some of the other frameworks that shape my practice. I have to draw on my professional accountability. I have to draw on my code of ethics. I have to draw on, standards, et cetera, and feed that into the decision making, which is then what shapes shared decision making. And some of that will enable me to reconnect with you and stay connected, and some of it means I can't do that part, or I'm not able to do that, but I could get someone who could. So it's not a dismissiveness of that personhood. But then it may be the third stance that Heidegger talks about, which is a complete disconnectedness, which is that actually we identify that we cannot work together, or that I've gone to the limit of my competence in being able to help you. And I believe really strongly we're not often honest enough about that as practitioners. It was a model we used a lot in my work in Oxford, actually, where we as a team, when working with really complex older people in a rehabilitation community rehab context, would have that conversation. I would be able to go to one of my primary nurse colleagues and say, I can't work with this person anymore. We're no longer compatible in terms of being working together. And that wasn't, seen as failure. It was seen as a point for us to discuss what was it that was getting in the way. And sometimes that might help me to go back in, but most of the time it was somebody else needs to take over this care. And I think we need to be more sophisticated in the way that we think about connections in that way. And that's how I see that kind of working, to be honest.
Thank you, Brendan. Very comprehensive answer.
Sorry, I don't mean to go into a lecture every time. But
Still got a couple more minutes. All good. Dr. Radburn, do you have something you want to ask?
Thanks, Kelly. Brendan, I'm really curious. You spent a lot of time working and having a global impact, and particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. Can you tell us a bit more about what you're noticing in the Southern Hemisphere in relation to person-centeredness, like specifically for us Aussies and people working in Australia? What are you seeing? What's the state of the nation from your perspective?
Ooh, it's a challenging question. What's my perspective? In many ways, it's no different, really. I think the issues within the health system are very similar to what I see happening around the world elsewhere in Western, developed nations, around person-centeredness. The same issues around, workforce, around culture, around toxic cultures, around cultures of disrespect, around an emphasis on KPIs rather than engagements and lived experience, and actually quite a significant lip service to the idea of person-centeredness. I think there are some really interesting things happening. I do see some really good models of good practice in some LHDs, actually, and in some other areas. The work I'm doing with the Policy Lab here around Australia Cares, for example, is really exciting in terms of elevating care and personhood to a kind of a national level as part of the relational economy type thing. And that's really exciting, and I've not seen that elsewhere. So I think all of that is very, very, very similar. I think what disappoints me, if I'm very honest, in Australia is a kind of a dismissiveness of person-centeredness as somehow it doesn't matter, and that we are kind of more obsessed about kind of an evidence-based practice that, for me, anyone can actually do, than we are about how do we really generate a relational context within our services. And I find that sad, actually, around some of the things that I see happening. And I know that Anne-Marie is here and we'll talk about the work that's happening in New South Wales, which is exciting and really good, but we need a lot more, and we need some really honest conversations about that. And the last thing I would say about it is, again, I think what is happening here with First Nations populations is terribly tragic, and we need to really lift our gaze in relation to how we apply and how we adapt all of this work to all persons, rather than inventing new things. Actually, really start to bring all of this together, and for me, that's a big goal I have in some small way.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it. And I'm very glad that you're in the country and really making a mark for person-centeredness here.
Thank you.
Maria Heaton, did you want to ask something?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brendan, for that amazing presentation. My interest is in people with intellectual disability, and I wanted to ask you, it's an area that's, very difficult from a patient perspective, and you've sort of referred to the elderly people, always saying yes, and you've talked about the First Nations people, and the statistics for people with intellectual disability are very similar to the people from First Nations groups. So the question that I had was, like, one of the biggest challenges is health staff's attitudes and values and stuff towards this group of people. So do you have any suggestions about how to navigate this space in bringing about change?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, Marie, and have done work in that area quite a lot over the years, actually. And I completely agree. I mean, if we talk about marginalized populations, then people with intellectual disabilities are incredibly marginalized. I think it's this. I mean, I often make connections between people with intellectual disabilities in my own area of expertise, which is people with dementia. That they're often treated in the same disrespectful ways. Fundamentally, that they are seen as lesser of a person, and that's the bottom line of it, is that their personhood is not seen as the same as other people's personhood. That personhood has somehow been eroded. And that is the danger we have, going back to my earlier response to Emma about this kind of dismissiveness of person-centeredness, is that we walk into a trap where we actually start to almost legitimize the disrespect of persons with disabilities and with dementia. The work that's been done in dementia around person-centered dementia care is phenomenal in terms of the way it has changed the lives of people with dementia around the world. And we should never forget that. We forget it at our peril, actually. And the same applies to people with intellectual disabilities. So I've been involved in work that have been around, using care passports, which I'm sure you have as well, using families to be the main care respondents, working with people to kind of really get to know somebody, not through their cognition, but through their embodied ways of being, using creativity to connect with people through emotional connection and relationships. But sadly, particularly in acute care, we see that all the time being eroded, and we see people being treated with utter disrespect. So we have a huge job to do around doing some of that, and we need much more integration across our systems to enable people in acute care in particular to understand what needs to happen when somebody with an intellectual disability is in their area. It's a massive issue.
Thank you so much.
It's bang on 11 o'clock, Brendan, and there's
Hey.